One nuclear strike on Ukraine could trigger the deadliest chain reaction humanity has ever seen. For almost 80 years, the world has lived with a silent rule that is, never use nuclear weapons in war again. Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no country has crossed that line. But what if Russia decides to break it today? What if, in the middle of its war with Ukraine, Moscow actually pushes the button? This is not just about Ukraine. It's about a chain of events that could spread across the globe, change how nations deal with each other, and even put humanity's survival at risk. To understand how real this danger is, we first need to see what Russia's nuclear plan looks like. When would we even think of using such weapons, and what kind of bombs are we really talking about? As we all know, Russia has one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. But doesn't mean Moscow can drop any bomb, anywhere, anytime. Officially, Russia's nuclear plan, its doctrine, says nukes can be used only if the country's survival is at risk, or if its territory is seriously threatened. In the Ukraine war, that rule has already been stretched because Russia now calls the areas it captured in Ukraine its own territory. This means if those regions are taken back, Moscow could claim its territory is under attack and use that as a reason to bring nukes into play. But what kind of nuclear strike are we talking about? A guess, not the giant city-flattening bombs from Cold War days. Experts believe Russia would likely use smaller, tactical nuclear weapons. These are designed for the battlefield and their power can be adjusted sometimes just 1 kiloton, sometimes more. To give you perspective, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 was about 15 kilotons. So even a small Russian nuke could destroy a town, a military base, or wipe out thousands of soldiers in one strike. In simple terms, Russia's nuclear options range from small tactical strikes to larger explosions, but the first use would most likely be limited, meant to scare the world without crossing into all-out nuclear war. If Russia ever crossed the nuclear line, the strike would not necessarily begin with a massive city-destroying bomb. It would most likely be something smaller, aimed at shocking the world while still trying to keep control of the escalation. One possibility is a tactical nuke dropped on a group of advancing Ukrainian forces. Such a weapon, even at a low yield, could wipe out an entire battalion, flatten a small town, or destroy a key supply hub in seconds. Another way Moscow might act is by detonating a bomb high above the ground, creating what's called an electromagnetic pulse. This wouldn't kill directly, but it could paralyze Ukraine's power grid, shut down communications, silence radars, and even cripple hospitals and essential services. Imagine an entire country forced into darkness within minutes. There is also the chance of a symbolic strike, like detonating a weapon over the Black Sea or in a deserted area. That kind of move would be less about immediate destruction and more about sending a chilling warning. The nuclear threshold has been broken. No matter which path is chosen, the first use of a nuclear weapon would send shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. For Ukraine, the consequences would be instant and brutal. Let's see what that would mean on the ground. The moment a nuclear weapon explodes on Ukrainian soil, the first reality would be devastation on the ground. A tactical nuke, even a small one, could erase an entire neighborhood, turn military bases into craters, and leave thousands dead or severely injured in seconds. The heat and shockwave would destroy buildings, vehicles, and equipment instantly, while radiation would poison the air, the soil, and even the water supply. Survivors near the blast would suffer burns, blindness, and long-term illnesses that Ukraine's already stretched hospitals could not handle. Beyond the physical damage, the psychological shock would be enormous. For ordinary people, the fear of living under a radioactive sky could force mass evacuations, creating a sudden refugee crisis. For soldiers, morale could swing in two opposite directions, as some might fight with even greater determination, while others might lose hope, believing that no amount of courage can stop a nuclear superpower. Infrastructure would also collapse quickly. Power grids, roads, and communication lines, which are already under pressure from months of war, would fail, leaving millions cut off. Food and medicine supplies would dry up and international aid would struggle to enter a radioactive war zone. In short, even one strike could cripple Ukraine's ability to fight and make daily survival a nightmare for civilians. But Ukraine would not face this alone. The first nuclear strike in Europe would throw NATO and the West into the hardest decision of modern history. On one hand, leaders would face pressure to act immediately and punish Russia. On the other, every move would risk pushing the world closer to all-out nuclear war. The most likely first step would be outrage and new waves of sanctions, but sanctions alone would look weak in front of such a massive escalation. That's why many analysts believe NATO would consider direct military involvement inside Ukraine. And with NATO's superior numbers and technology, Russia would struggle in a long conventional fight. But there's a catch. If NATO enters the battlefield directly, what stops Russia from firing more nukes to slow them down? One tactical strike could lead to another, and suddenly the red line becomes blurry. The United States does have its own tactical nuclear weapons, small warheads carried by bombers or cruise missiles that could match Russia blow for blow. But using them risks opening a door that humanity may never be able to close again. This is the tightrope NATO would walk, that is, act too weak and nuclear threats become normal, act too strong and the world slides into nuclear confrontation. That is why experts fear the first bomb wouldn't just endanger Ukraine, it could pull the entire alliance into a deadly spiral. And once that spiral begins, the escalation ladder is almost impossible to control. Once the nuclear line is crossed, controlling what happens next becomes almost impossible. At first, Moscow might use just one small weapon, hoping the shock is enough to freeze Ukraine's advances and scare NATO into backing off. But history shows that wars rarely stop at the first step. If NATO responds with powerful conventional strikes, Russia could feel cornered and answer with another nuke. One strike turns into two, then three, and the scale keeps rising. There is also the idea of escalate to de-escalate, a Russian strategy that suggests hitting hard early with nuclear weapons to force the enemy into negotiations. In theory, a sudden burst of nuclear firepower could make NATO hesitate. But in practice, it risks doing the opposite, that is, uniting the West and inviting retaliation on a scale Russia cannot handle. The most dangerous part is that each side would constantly be guessing the other's limits. How many nukes would NATO tolerate before responding in kind? And once NATO replies with its own nuclear strikes, what stops the conflict from spreading beyond Ukraine into Russian territory and even into NATO countries themselves? The ladder of escalation has no clear end. A handful of tactical strikes could eventually open the door to larger warheads, long-range missiles, and finally the nightmare of global nuclear exchange. And while governments play this deadly game, the rest of the world would start feeling the shockwaves in their daily lives. Countries around the world would be forced to pick sides, and even long-standing friendships could be tested. China, for example, has been walking a careful line in this war. It supports Russia economically, but avoids being seen as a direct partner in aggression. A nuclear strike would put Beijing in a tight spot. Publicly, it may condemn the attack because normalizing nuclear use would make the world more unstable, something China does not want. Privately, though, it might still maintain trade and political support, unwilling to let Russia collapse. India, too, would face pressure. As a nation that values global stability and relies on both Western and Russian ties, New Delhi could call for peace but avoid taking harsh action. Meanwhile, countries like North Korea might openly cheer Russia's move, while most of the world would strongly denounce it. Even inside NATO, unity is not guaranteed. Some nations might demand an immediate military response, while others could fear dragging their people into a nuclear war. That division alone could slow down decision-making at the very moment when speed matters most. And beyond the politics, there's an even darker message such a strike would send, that nuclear weapons are usable again. For decades, the world has lived with the idea that nukes exist only for deterrence, not for the battlefield. If Russia breaks that taboo, other countries with nuclear ambitions could be encouraged to follow. Suddenly, the global order becomes far more dangerous than before. But politics and power struggles are only part of the fallout. The other part would hit ordinary people everywhere, in their markets, in their jobs, and in their food supplies. A nuclear strike in Ukraine wouldn't stay confined to the battlefield. The shock would ripple into markets, economies, and everyday life around the world. Energy prices would likely skyrocket overnight as investors panic and supply chains are disrupted. Europe, already struggling with gas shortages, could face blackouts and soaring costs. Food supplies would also take a hit. Ukraine is one of the world's biggest exporters of wheat and corn. If farmland turns radioactive or if transport routes collapse, millions across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East could go hungry. For Ukraine itself, the humanitarian crisis would deepen beyond imagination. Cities near the blast zone could become unlivable for years. Radiation would make entire regions unsafe, forcing families to abandon their homes forever. Refugee waves would crash into neighboring countries like Poland, Romania, and beyond, straining resources and creating long-term instability. Aid organizations would be powerless in areas poisoned by radiation, and rebuilding would be nearly impossible while the war still rages. The global economy, already fragile, could tumble into recession or even depression. Stock markets would crash, currencies would wobble, and ordinary people, far from Ukraine, would feel the impact in lost jobs, rising prices, and growing insecurity. The real question is, if that day comes, will the world be able to stop at one strike, or will the chain reaction carry us into chaos? Share your thoughts in the comments, and I shall see you in the next one, folks. Thanks for watching.